be a bad idea. I mean, it's an interesting point. But if it's clear what you're doing is just purely speculative, people are not silly. And if there are 7 shareholders and you just write 2 emails to all 7, they will know that that's what you're doing. And they may wonder, especially depending on the nature of those emails, how serious you really are. So I think it's really important that you do it in a really professional and respectful way, because remember...
Welcome to the RolyPoly, the podcast about all things roll-up. Today we're speaking to Andrew Ofori from Bloomvine. If you're making acquisitions, you want to tune into this episode. Bloomvine is a deal sourcer. They work exclusively on the buy side, helping acquirers figure out what they want to buy and then going out and finding it for them. Think consulting meets sourcing. We get into why the first 2 or 3 acquisitions can be make it or break it for your roll-up, how AI is changing the landscape and the way that he works day to day, and why reaching out to all shareholders is probably a terrible idea. Andrew also shares where he's seeing a shift in the market, software multiples being stretched and investors moving over to asset-based businesses. This is a really interesting episode and I hope you enjoy it. Let's get into it. Hello, Andrew. Thank you for joining me on my little corner of the internet today. How are you doing?
Doing very well, and it's great to be here.
We met at the Serial Acquirers Conference a few weeks ago, and you told me how you do deal sourcing. You know, I hear that all the time has been a big pain point in M&A is actually finding good deals. Because if you find a good deal and you buy a good business, everything follows up after that. But then after we met, I went and stalked you a little bit on your LinkedIn, and I was really impressed. You worked at McKinsey, you've been at Goldman Sachs for 11 years, co-running structured lending business across emerging markets. And at some point, you decided to leave all of that and start something from scratch. Could you take me back to that moment? What was going through your head?
Yeah, I've been lucky. It's been an incredibly interesting run. And so I think what really started to drive it, maybe it's helpful to start with what I learned at those types of institutions. So the things that really kind of put the building blocks in place were just the level of rigor and also the level of client focus that drives those types of businesses. They're pretty fundamental to what we do today. It became pretty clear that deal sourcing, number one, was a key pain point for GPs, sponsors, and acquisitive companies. And we are now in a phase where these can be solved with people that know it well, but also with various tools and the use of data. And so the opportunity was pretty compelling to kind of move into that and work with clients on kind of helping to solve those problems. And you know, we love working with clients, and that was definitely a key part of the attraction as well.
Andrew, you're not a broker, are you? You're a deal sourcer. Can you tell me what the difference is?
Absolutely. So a broker, irrespective of buy side, sell side, a broker is more someone that has transactions, is identifying transactions and putting people together. So they are, to some extent, they are sourcing, but they are more about recognizing opportunities, often from the sell side actually, and presenting that to potentially interested buyers. And even when a broker works for a buy side, they often have a transaction in mind or a potential company in mind. We act exclusively for the buy side, and we are much more focused on a client coming to us with an idea around how they want to develop either their business or a strategy within their portfolio. The way we look at it is much closer to consulting as opposed to just broking. So we help them think through what's in the market. We investigate their hypotheses and we try and make it real through kind of our acquisition sourcing process. But it actually starts at a much kind of more strategic level when working with us, which is, I have these ideas and I think that this could be interesting for the business, or these are my priorities for my particular assets. How can I make this real? And that's much more kind of I would say a strategic kind of thoughtful process that we step people through, as opposed to let's matchmake between the available buyers and sellers in the market.
So your incentives are also a little bit different than what a broker's incentives might be. Could you walk me through what happens when a PE firm comes to you and says, we've got a platform company, we need add-ons. Where does Bloomvine start in that process?
We start at one of the most important parts of the process, which is we really need to understand what the acquirer motivations are. So we spend a lot of time with the acquiring company to understand, yes, the criteria, but also What is it exactly you are trying to achieve and why? What's your history with M&A? What's your infrastructure to execute M&A, particular locations, capabilities that you're looking to develop? At what point in time are you potentially looking to exit? Is it a longer term thing? How do you see your proposition to a potential target? And so we have a really kind of in-depth discussion with them around the criteria, but also on much broader topics that impact their ability to acquire. What that does is it allows us to kind of step into their shoes when we are running this process, because ultimately what we're trying to do is to execute on this process in the same way that they would if they had the time, the resources, and were able to dedicate everything that we have to this process. And so the first stage really is trying to get to know the client, get to know the acquisition company, get to know the individuals involved in the process. And that helps us to understand more about why they're interested in these companies and how we should be thinking about their acquisition path. From there, we move through to a kind of what's often termed a list build. And so we use a combination of AI tools, databases, and just free searches through our analysts to build a comprehensive picture of the landscape of what makes sense for them. And then within that, we start to screen down what might make sense from a kind of what the high potential candidates are. The interesting thing is that that's a very, very thoughtful process, because when doing that, there is the opportunity to start to develop the criteria for the client, because the analyst and the team that are working on this are seeing kind of really what's happening at the coalface over time. And so that gives us the ability to develop the criteria with them. The criteria at the beginning of a study are very, very rarely the criteria at the end of the study. And that's because we incorporate what we learn through the process into search criteria. And then the final phase is that we have a team that focus on making contact with these companies. It's a team that's broadly across it's pan-European and North American. And it's really, really important that they are from the local cultures, speak the local language, have been in business themselves. So the people that we use are often founders. That's a really good source of this type of reaching out. We will have those discussions, and then we will kind of make the initial assessment as to whether this company could work for our client, and vice versa. That's an important part of it. Does this make sense for this particular target? Because we're trying to maximize the probability of acquisition when we make those introductions.
Okay, a few things I want to unpack there, but just before I do that, at what point do you hand over the conversation to the client?
It tends to be after the client has spoken to the target company a few times. There are instances where we go slightly longer than that. And so there are instances, particularly where we have a strong relationship and the client has a need from a resources point of view. And we can really facilitate this process through taking the initial steps of NA, the NDAs, working through the initial financial analysis, the initial information requests, and pushing things through to an LOI. In going back to the point that we are not a broker, we don't execute on the M&A. We are very, very focused on building an efficient funnel that gets to high probability conversations in a relatively short period. And that's where we dedicate our time. The M&A market is very effectively served. And I think we can add a lot more by focusing on one step before that.
No, yeah, that makes sense. And then you mentioned that some of the exercises you do are what the company would do internally if they had the resources.
Absolutely.
When should they work with someone like Bloomvine, and when should they handle these things internally?
That's an interesting one. It's partially dependent on their model. So if we look at, for example, private equity companies, to some extent, there are times where they acquire a company and that company can have a strong history in M&A. So they might have a business development function, they'll have a head of they clearly know their sector or their subsector super well. So they're clearly well positioned and credible within that space. If they have that type of infrastructure and they are really, really specific about who they want where, often the case is post-acquisition, that team will know who they want to acquire and who makes sense for them, at least in the first phase of M&A. And so it's much more sensible to have that happen internally. They're well positioned to do it. They understand the targets. Oftentimes they know the targets, and they also know the targets that they don't want. And so when you're in kind of your country, within your subsector and you know that well, that's often much far better to do internally. It's when you start to think more strategically about expanding your company, and that could be in a different region, in a new sector, or even within your sector, a new capability or a new customer set. Or if you want to drive, if we focus on customers, if you want to drive your expansion of your customer base extensively within a short period of time, those are the times where it often makes sense to work with a partner that can kind of link into your existing business development function and drive a lot of kind of throughput through that process without overwhelming the team, because that partner is going to do a lot of kind of the filtration for you. Outside of that, the times where many companies are hugely focused on what they do, and the kind of M&A element is not something that they've experienced, that is also a clear kind of use case for using a partner where they can bring all of the different elements that are required within the M&A kind of, or the initial early M&A skill set to the management team.
Okay. So a few different use cases. I'm going to paraphrase here, but essentially if they need speed, if they go into uncharted territory, whether that's different types of industries or cross borders, if they maybe don't have the skill set yet internally because it hasn't been a primary focus in the past and they just want to focus on the business. So there's a few different reasons to come to you.
And it raises an interesting point in that oftentimes, you can acquire a company that you want to acquire but they have multiple initiatives that they're working on post-acquisition. In the 100 plan, there'll probably be specific functions that the investor will want to kind of help develop within the company. There's only so much bandwidth that the companies have and they've got to kind of develop their business within a specific hold period. So that being the case, it can help having someone in the background that can add a little bit of capacity to the overall management team. The other thing that's also really interesting that we've kind of recently been doing a lot of are the pre-acquisition searches. So if you kind of elevate your question one level to the private equity firms themselves, at what point does it make sense for them to use a partner when thinking about an acquisitive strategy within a given subsector? They often need to go to committee with a very kind of well thought out, proven plan for why a particular asset has a strong M&A case. One way to prove it out is to work with a partner that can go and maybe run a mini project or a very focused project within a specific point in time as another work stream to the committee process and run the initial search for high probability candidates only. So less kind of speculative and comprehensive in nature, and maybe talk to 5-10 companies within that. So 5 and 10 of those high potential candidates. And that enables investors to go to committee with a highly credible case that this is an interesting M&A-driven asset, and there are real opportunities within this sector.
I see. So you help build the case. I want to loop back to something we've mentioned a couple of times already, and that is cross-border deal sourcing.
Right.
When it comes to this, how different can the approaches be? And do you have any specific examples?
I think we'll probably come back to this topic a few times during this discussion, but the culture and local understanding of the market within which you are in is critical to almost all of these processes. It really is. And I think it's something that can be hard to overcome if you don't have a natural affinity with that space, or it's not really a region that you've been in before. Those things can be difficult. And culture isn't just what country someone comes from or what country a company operates within. It's, what sector you're in, what function does the company provide? Is it software? Is it services? Is it assets? To what extent is it a highly technical versus a kind of a more soft skill culture? I think the culture of the people, the company, all of those, it's a nexus between many different aspects to really understand a company's culture. And it does take time. And I think it does take quite a lot of investment of your own infrastructure to be able to kind of broach different cultures. So it's definitely a critical topic. And going back to your question, it really does drive the way that one approaches the M&A process, particularly our part of the M&A process, where you take it from zero contact and an idea to a real conversation. And it drives things like how you approach a particular company based on where it is and what it does. If it's a highly software-driven company on the west coast of the US, that is a really particular type of culture where the way you approach them is often through social media. That's the typical way to start making an approach to those types of companies. And then they will look at things like your social media presence. They'll look at your network to see if you have anyone in common. They'll want to understand kind of, to what extent you're a software person versus someone that's just a pure intermediary. If you're trying to speak to somebody that's kind of in let's say an asset-based leasing company in Sweden, that's a family company and been there for decades, that's a very different individual that needs to do that in a very different way. That could be anything from an email, maybe a call, maybe a letter, maybe networking into somebody that can make an introduction. They're completely different approaches. You can try different methods for each, which is what we often do. But the way you approach what you say, how you say it, who the person is, all of those things need to be taken into account when you make these types of decisions as to we are now in this culture, within this industry, what makes sense for the most comfortable way to kind of make a connection to that particular individual.
In Europe, there's a lot of discussions now about, well, there have been, I guess, for a while, but about the succession wave where millions of business owners are approaching retirement with no plan. From a sourcing perspective, how real is that pipeline?
It is clearly industry specific, and I think it's something that it's way harder to access than is often presented, but it is a fundamental part of where acquisition opportunities come from. I think the reality is that there are we know that this kind of founder generation is retiring, and it is often the case that succession isn't necessarily an easy topic for them because there is no one to hand down to. That being said, it's really interesting when you get into conversations like that because they are still really, really careful about who is going to be the next steward of this company that I've spent my life building. And it's not as kind of simple as I have no options. There are options. And they often know people that within their own sector that would be interested in acquiring these companies. I think sometimes their ability to solve that particular problem is underplayed. That being said, what the really interesting thing about the opportunity is when you broaden the field of options for them by reaching out to them and having these conversations, it is often really appreciated. And you can create opportunities through focusing on that part of the market. It's something that when we do kind of really broad searches and we're speaking to lots of different types of founders, it's almost always the case that a certain portion of that are people that are thinking about succession. Even when you're thinking about maybe much younger industries, like things like marketing solutions within software, it is still the case. And so that's always something that is appreciated by the target if you approach them in the right way, and is a large feature to kind of focus on across the market. I think it is quite hard to just look at it as a theme in its own right. I think that is tough. It is possible, and we've seen it done in various places like Germany, like Japan, but you do need to have the right infrastructure, and it is still quite a difficult thing to just focus on exclusively.
What are these targets looking for in buyers when they're thinking of succession?
It varies. I mean, there are the discussions where it is about price and building a kind of pool of wealth for the next generation, and those ones are clearly a lot more transparent and easy to deal with in some ways. But I think that often there is more to it than that. Price is always if not the critical factor, clearly. But there are times where we're in a few conversations at the moment, for example, where the key outside of price, the key decision factor for the seller is who will be the best caretaker of my employees. Some of them have been with them for decades, or they've taken them from, out of university and created them into kind of a very effective professional. They feel that they owe them that, the ability to make sure that this is not going to be a very disruptive kind of uncomfortable process for their employees. And so that's how they think about buyers. Who is going to be the best steward? That will bias them towards strategics, for example. And so those things can be overcome and discussed, but I think that there needs to be genuine intent to solve some of these problems when speaking to people that are looking for succession options, because you need to spend time understanding what are the things that are really important to them, and am I the right buyer to provide solutions to that?
I see. Yeah, it makes sense. Shifting gears a little bit here, with the increased popularity of roll-ups, frequently getting asked by aspiring operators, which industry should they go for? What should they pick? What sector? What advice would you give them?
So when we think about kind of the serial acquirers, as you and I have been very close to recently, I think there are two. It falls into two buckets. There are the kind of the generalist serial acquirers who are much more kind of opportunistic, thinking about strategy, thinking about what it is that they could do within their kind of sphere of either influence or knowledge. And then there are the more focused kind of classic serial acquirers who tend to, like the compounders that we met in Sweden, who are very, very long term, have kind of consistent access to capital and can go very, very specific on a given sector. And I think the approaches for the two of them are different. I think for the generalists, I think one of the key success factors is just really doing your in-depth research around the sector and developing a view and a vision for how that sector is going to develop. If you're thinking about a private equity company, the reality is that if they are thinking about a roll-up within a particular field, that needs to happen within a prescribed period of time, 7 years maybe. That requires you to have a really good view, at least in terms of on two things. Obviously, where the sector is going, but what the right initial asset is. Because within a period that's relatively short where you want to kind of roll up a lot, it can become, the success of that is incredibly path dependent. That your first 2-3 acquisitions need to perform quite strongly to allow you to continue to generate the cash flow, to allow you to have the time, frankly, so you don't have to focus on issues within the portfolio in order to continue the velocity of acquisition. And so you really need to do your work on what you think is likely to happen in the medium term and why this sector, it makes sense for a roll-up. And I think following others is a dangerous justification. That being said, you feel the pressure of having to acquire, but the first 2 or 3 acquisitions that you make, you need to spend time making sure that those are the right solutions for you as you're looking to build out your platform. For the serial acquirers, I mean, they've been hugely successful in terms of making sure that, in terms of building out their businesses over the long term. And there they have the benefit of time. For them, a lot of it seems to be about the timing and when it makes sense to be more aggressive about their acquisition pace, and when it makes sense to step back and be highly opportunistic about maybe the underlying dynamics of this market are difficult in this environment, but there are really good businesses out there that have strong operations that might need capital injections in order to continue to grow. So how can I specifically identify those? And if you take the Swedish compounders, they've been an excellent example of people that do it well, then use their sector knowledge, each acquisition teaching them more in order to make the next successful acquisition.
Yeah. You mentioned timing, and now with tariffs, macro uncertainty with the war, have you noticed any changes in the projects you're working on or in the landscape as a whole?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the sector, the focus constantly evolves within the sphere of what we do. So most of what we focus on, I'd say about 50% of what we focus on is software, technology, tech-enabled services. And then we also look at healthcare and industrials. Outside of that, we do add sectors that are more thematic, particularly within private equity. And so clearly defense has been a huge topic within that. Interestingly, because of what's happened with software valuations, partially driven by obviously the advent of AI, but also because of extremely aggressive acquisition within that space that has driven up multiples, people are looking for other things that could kind of balance out that risk. And so, now kind of the rate environment, at least until recently, has been a little bit more stable in the medium to long end. Asset-based businesses that kind of generate long-term cash flows have been really interesting. Assets, for example, that you would lease out for the long term, or even short-term projects with underlying long-term contracts, have become quite popular, particularly when there's value-added services that you can layer on top. And I guess a couple of examples are, for example, temporary traffic assets, so things that help with kind of temporary construction sites. We lease them out. Those have been interesting. Remote energy units, remote security solutions, things like that we've seen quite a lot of rotation into those types, at least rotation of interest into those types of sectors. And our view is that plus industrials are likely to be more focused on going forward than they have been over the past kind of 2 to 3 years.
Okay, that's really interesting. I think it's you have to be on top of shifts in the market, especially if, like you say, you're gonna set up a thesis on a specific industry. There's so much uncertainty at the moment, so it's interesting to see. That also brings a lot of opportunity, right? A lot of places that you can dive into.
Absolutely.
Zooming out into sort of, you mentioned AI before, that you use AI, and also how AI is impacting deal sourcing. Could you tell me a little bit about how the technology is helping you today, and if it's a hype or if it's actually impacting Bloomvine a lot?
Yeah, I mean, it's transforming us. I think I would like to say yearly, but I think it's getting to the point where it's kind of quarterly at this point. Yeah, it's definitely been a game changer for our business. And I think in many cases, there's an argument to say kind of it commoditizes a lot of what we do. The reality is that when you start to look at how to affect source within kind of very specific niches, which is what we do because we mostly focus on add-on acquisitions, um, it empowers you to do that in really, really specific ways when you have a good kind of underlying process and approach that you can use it for. I think where the specific areas where it's helped us is clearly it helps us a lot with the research. It's made that a lot more, not just efficient, but also comprehensive in what we do. It also helps with some of the insights from the conversations that we get. And that's something that maybe isn't immediately apparent in kind of the front end of our process, but you can use the kind of the macro environment, for example, of that particular sector, or who people see as competition within that particular sector, to inform what you're going to do next when you're working on a search. Because a search is essentially a journey. It's not just simply a blind application of the criteria. It is an iterative process to get to the right answer. And using the insights from the conversations that we're having is a key part of that. And AI enables you to do that in a really, really effective way. And so I'd say there are specific kind of parts of the workflow where we implement it. But the overall kind of opportunity set that comes from the fact that AI is changing the infrastructure on which we build workflows. And we're in a state of flux with that. So it's not when we know we're never at the end and we know that things have changed. But where we are on that spectrum is very difficult to tell. So the way that we and our workflow is that it needs to be extremely flexible in terms of how it uses AI. So sometimes we have a CTO, we have various project engineers, and they build tools sometimes just really specifically for a given search or for a given function within a search. And then sometimes we'll use external tools. Sometimes we'll use a comprehensive tool that goes across the search process. But that changes, I would say, every quarter. So we have to build a workflow that's hugely modular and has the ability to incorporate the different products and systems that are coming into the market, because there's just so much opportunity in kind of staying flexible in this environment.
Could you tell us more about specific tools or specific workflows you use, just to get some ideas?
So there are tools, for example, a lot of the databases that people use, everything from kind of PitchBook through to Grata, they all implement AI now. And so they all enable you to start to apply your criteria in a really specific way. They just make things quicker. You can use things like Claude and Chat GPT to enable you to search for really specific things within, either to kind of pass your shortlist into things that are very high potential or maybe tier 2, maybe tier 3. And that the way that it does it can be changed as you learn more about your industry. So you can start to use some of these tools to help you screen. Now, our approach is that everything that we do is ultimately leveraging an analyst, because there are so many soft factors in the screening process that using AI to empower our analyst or our outreach person is always kind of our approach for now. We never really remove the person from the process, but understanding, why this company might be interested, or there may be things within the overall business model that just make it a no-go. That information can be easily found by AI, and we use that to help the person make decisions. Our view on these things is that what AI used, the suboptimal use of AI is to help it to commoditize your search process, so that for a given lead or a given target company, it's treated exactly the same as every other lead that you have and every other company that you've looked at. Whereas our approach is there is a lot that you get far better results from being really specific about how you do things in each individual situation. And that takes someone that is leveraging the tool in the right way for that given situation. It's not a kind of a one-stop shop. The one stop fits all is a very you lose a lot of the potential when you do that.
Yeah, I agree with you. AI, but with humans in the loop, is always going to get much better output.
Absolutely,
much better results.
We've seen it. We've seen it. We've tried both, and we've seen that.
Yeah, that's interesting. But if you can leverage AI and make your team work, 2-3 times faster and get better results and be able to maybe find opportunities, whereas in the past they might have been
Make sure
missed.
things aren't missed. Absolutely.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Do you have any specific tips you could give if, let's say, a listener is trying to find a seller and maybe they're not getting any responses? Is it because they're looking in the wrong place? Are they doing a wrong outreach strategy? What advice would you give them?
The first piece of advice I always give the people in that scenario is that it's not really about you, it's about them. And I'm sure that means a couple of things. First of all, when we receive these outreaches, there is no guarantees that that person has time to focus on that at that point in time, or will remember the next day that they even received that outreach attempt, irrespective of which channel it came through. So there is the need for a certain level of respectful persistence in trying to make contact with the seller. That it's a skill to understand the difference between kind of persistent and annoying, and we've been in the position to be able to understand that over a long period of time in many different searches. So yeah, the first thing is just, sometimes, we'll reach out to people up to, and on some occasions 10 times, but that will be over the course of maybe 3 months, because there may just be windows where a person has the mind space to even read the email or read the LinkedIn message and respond to you, or take the call. And so that is, it's maybe not the most kind of insightful solution, but it is definitely a huge part of the solution. The other thing is that you need to do your research on the seller. You need to do your research on the person that you are trying to contact. Sometimes that person is not responding to you because you are talking to the wrong person, and you just you've looked on, for example, Companies House or a company's registry, seen it says shareholder or CEO, and sent an email. That might not be the right person. They might have moved the operations of the business onto a son or a daughter, for example, or they may have recently hired a professional CEO, and you're trying to contact the CEO, and that CEO has no real bearing on the decision of whether that company is to be sold or not. So you do have to really spend time understanding the dynamics of that particular company, understanding whether this person would have an interest in having that discussion, and then understanding how that person may be susceptible to being approached. And in the approach, I would always recommend that people try and tailor that particular message or attempt to that individual in quite a specific way. These things take time. Our contention is that time has a return. And so even I, for example, get outreach messages from people asking me if I'm interested in selling the business. The answer for now is no, but given that I am in this space, I do read these messages when I get them, and it's amazing how many times it's effectively spam. And by definition, those are not going to be very successful.
Okay, that's really insightful, actually. So first is be persistent, don't just send one email and expect a response. Don't probably do sort of a massive bulk send to thousands of people. Actually do your research, find the right person to contact, and then when you're contacting them, probably personalize the message or email or social media message, like you said before. What happens if you find that there is multiple shareholders in a company? How do you know who to reach out to there? Do you usually go for the operator owner, or do you go to the majority shareholder? Which is the best person to reach out to usually?
Yeah, it can depend on the type of company again. So unfortunately, there aren't kind of just silver bullets for this, but generally, I think an owner operator is an interesting starting point because many majority shareholders, are passive at that point in time. And so someone that's actually in the business understands the dynamics. Everyone will understand, but someone that's kind of at the coalface and maybe is feeling the need for external capital in order to move the business to the next phase on a daily basis, they might be more open to something than a majority shareholder that's thinking of it purely in kind of financial return perspective, or maybe legacy perspectives. And so, yeah, in that type of scenario, we would probably go with an owner operator. But that being said, there are scenarios where the opposite may be the case. If it's somebody that's maybe reaching retirement, has clearly their name is all over the business. It's clearly a part of them, and they are still seem to be involved in the key decisions of that company. Maybe that person is the best, but that's just a question of sequencing. You do need to maybe try different people within the sphere of the decision makers to see where that decision may most be appropriate. And that's often the way to figure out who the right person is.
Okay, I see. So try owner operator. If that doesn't work, just reach out to all of them and see how that turns out.
All of them can be a bad idea. I mean, it's an interesting point, but if it's clear what you're doing is just purely speculative, people are not silly. And if there are 7 shareholders and you just write 2 emails to all 7, they will know that that's what you're doing. And they may wonder, especially depending on the nature of those emails, how serious you really are. So I think it's really important that you do it in a really professional and respectful way, because remember, I think what happens a lot of the time is that people sometimes get caught out in the trap that I'm not trying to sell anything. I'm trying to maybe provide a transformational opportunity to your company. And absolutely, that can be the case. But we also need to keep in mind that you are asking for them to have a conversation about probably their most valuable asset in quite a sensitive way. So to reveal sensitive information from that. And that is not going to happen without some degree of credibility and trust. And so you really do have to be quite empathetic in the way that you make these approaches.
That makes sense. What's the biggest mistake you've seen or made when it comes to sourcing acquisitions?
So I think it goes back to a couple of the things that we've mentioned. Absolutely, just treating every single potential lead as the same, even when you're in a really specific sector within a really specific country, is a mistake in many cases. There are situations where for necessity, people need to look at it as a numbers game. I mean, we see that a lot in things like at one point within veterinary practices or HVAC providers, where it's important that you get to a certain critical mass within a certain period of time. And then maybe the numbers game approach works. And it's an approach that we adopt. It's rare, but there are times where that is the right approach. But I think in most cases, particularly in what we do, which tends to be quite strategic and very kind of focused on achieving particular objectives, you cannot commoditize your approach. You need to make everything really, really specific in terms of outreach and also just in terms of selection of companies and how you are screening. The databases are useful, but we find that a lot of our really high potential candidates comes from our analyst research, just thinking around the topic, kind of taking an iterative approach to finding names, finding companies, and then doing kind of real research on them. That's where I'd say about half of our names come from, even though we do everything we can to leverage the databases and AI. So again, it goes back to that kind of investment of time. And I think that's where some of these mistakes come from, in that it's perfectly understandable kind of as an investor, particularly kind of the private equity firms, they're on a time scale. They need to get something done within a period of time in order to achieve these kind of M&A objectives. And so there is limited time. But that being said, spending real time researching and preparing for this process has a real return to it as well in terms of the outcome from an acquisition perspective.
Okay, thank you for that. This is the final question, a question I ask every guest.
Okay.
Who do you think is doing interesting work in the M&A space? Someone you'd want to hear from on a podcast like this?
So there's a couple of people that I think would be really interesting. One's more of a profile, and one is a particular person. So I think the M&A team at something like a Google or Meta is super interesting to hear from. because if you look at they have made some of the most successful acquisitions from a financial perspective that have in history. And they've done it in a world that's been changing at the fastest velocity we've seen. And they use M&A to almost reinvent themselves. So it's not necessarily an incremental, skill set or capability or EBITDA expansion that they're looking for. They are looking for something that changes the nature of who they are. And that to me is a really interesting kind of problem that they are consistently solving and have successfully done so on a number of occasions. So I think, how they think about M&A and how it kind of moves from strategy through to execution would be a really interesting story to hear. And then I think the other sort of people are the people at the coalface. And this is absolutely, I'm sure you could find quite a few conversations in this space, are the search funds. So at the other end. So the search funds where, by definition, what they're doing is acquiring, they're not operating. But listening to some of their stories about those that have done it well and have solved the whole path dependency of that growth process, I think they would be a really interesting set of people to talk to, because for them, it is life or death in terms of getting M&A right. And as we know, we're still in a phase where I think it's improving, but most or a large portion of M&A transactions are not successful. And so their ability to kind of solve that problem. And I think the thing that's become very clear to me in doing this business is that hustle, no matter at what level it's done, hustle is so key to making a success of it. And that is exactly who they are. I think there's a lot to be learned from what they do.
Yeah, two very good ideas. The first with going to these big mega companies and see how they think about M&A. We have, for example, Alphabet has acquired, I think, like 260 companies. So they do love to acquire. They don't build as much. Any product they've tried to build kind of flops as well. Google Glasses, I'm looking at you. But then they do love, they're very acquisitive. So that's a good one. And in search funds, I'm based here in Spain, and Spain has the second most amount of search funds in all of the world, which is crazy for a small country.
Yeah.
So that's really interesting. I think you might have actually met the first search fund in Spain guy, Mark. He was at the conference. I don't know if you spoke to him. Okay. So yeah, maybe I can try and convince him to come on.
Maybe the two of us could talk to him. I'd definitely have questions for him.
Yeah, I'll try and organize that. But Andrew, thank you so much for coming on to the RolyPoly.
Well, it's been fantastic meeting you at the conference and on this podcast. I really enjoyed the discussion. I'd be happy to come back.